It was Christmas Eve, and our family was traveling by train to spend the holidays at my grandparents' house. The atmosphere inside the carriage was cozy, with warm lighting and the rhythmic sound of the train wheels cutting through the stillness of the night. There weren't many passengers on board, and we ended up sharing the space with just one other traveler, an elderly man with a peculiar appearance, holding a strange package on his lap. The gift was wrapped in old-fashioned paper, decorated with faded pine trees and reindeer. He smiled at us as we sat down, and although his expression was friendly, there was something about him that unsettled me. He struck up a conversation with ease, asking about our destination and reminiscing about how trains always brought back good memories for him. My mom replied politely, while my dad seemed more reserved. The man mentioned he was also traveling to visit someone but avoided giving too many details. What intrigued me was how he seemed to know small things about us, even though we hadn't told him much. He commented on how wonderful it must be to spend Christmas with family, and how traveling with kids must bring joy. I shrank back in my seat, feeling slightly uneasy as he looked directly at me with a smile that seemed to know more than it should. But before I could dwell on it, he turned to gaze out the window, letting the conversation fade. During the ride, the man held the package with great care, adjusting the ribbon occasionally and seeming lost in thought. I couldn't stop staring at it, wondering what might be inside. There was something about the way he cradled it that made it impossible to ignore. At one point, he looked straight at me and said, "Sometimes the best gifts come with secrets." The words seemed harmless enough, but the way he said them sent chills down my spine. I glanced at my mom, hoping she'd heard it too, but she was preoccupied with my younger brother. As the train began to slow unexpectedly, we all exchanged confused looks. There wasn't a scheduled stop in this stretch, and the darkness outside was almost absolute, save for the faint lights of a distant village. The man calmly stood up, retrieved his hat and coat, and walked toward the door. My mom murmured, "Is he getting off here? This isn't a scheduled stop." Before we could ask him anything, he simply smiled at us, gave a slight wave and stepped off, leaving the package on the seat where he had been sitting. We sat frozen, listening to the door close and the train slowly picking up speed again. My dad was the first to break the silence. He forgot his gift. The package sat there on the seat, almost as if it were staring back at us. My mom suggested we hand it to the conductor, but my dad thought it would be better to leave it at the station when we arrived, in case the man came back for it. For a moment, we considered just leaving it alone, but curiosity began to take over. Who would leave something so carefully wrapped behind, only to disembark at an unscheduled stop? After a brief debate, my dad picked up the package and placed it on the table between us. "Maybe we should open it and see if there's anything that identifies the owner," he said, almost as if justifying the decision to himself. My heart raced as he untied the ribbon, a deep sense of unease gnawing at me. When he finally removed the wrapping, we found a small wooden box inside, intricately decorated with symbols I had never seen before. There was something unnerving about it, as though it didn't belong in this world. My dad carefully opened it, revealing a collection of items that seemed to be tied to our family. An old photograph of my grandparents, a brooch my mom had lost years ago, and even a wooden toy my younger brother used to carry everywhere when he was little. Each item held a deeply personal significance, and their presence in that box was, at best, disturbing. My mom went pale when she saw the brooch. She recognized it immediately but couldn't comprehend how it had ended up there. "This was stolen when we moved, years ago," she said, her voice trembling. My dad held the photograph of my grandparents, visibly uneasy. He remembered seeing it at their house before they passed away, but it had disappeared long ago. I felt increasingly unsettled, staring at the objects as though they were pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense. At the bottom of the box was a letter, written in an old, shaky handwriting. My dad opened it and began to read aloud. The words were cryptic. "Blood ties never fade. We have always been connected, even if you didn't know." The carriage seemed to grow colder as the words hung in the air. My mom began to question who the man was and how he could have obtained such personal items. My dad, however, stayed silent, his expression unreadable. Finally, he muttered, "I've seen that man before. His voice was low, almost a whisper. He explained that he recognized the man as someone who used to wander around the neighborhood where he grew up, always alone and observing from a distance. He seemed harmless, but no one knew who he was. And now, decades later, he shows up here with this. This wasn't a coincidence. Somehow, the man knew who we were and had chosen us to receive that gift. We sat in silence, trying to piece together what it all meant. My dad seemed lost in thought, while my mom clutched the brooch as if it were a ghost from her past. The train continued on its route, but time felt frozen inside the carriage. Then I noticed something even stranger. The letter contained details no one else could know. One line read, "The brooch was always close, even when you believed it was lost." Another mentioned a specific trip my dad took as a teenager. Something he had never told anyone, not even me or my mom. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured, running a hand through his hair. How could he know these things? My mom tried to rationalize, suggesting it was a coincidence, that someone had found the objects and decided to return them in an eccentric way. But nothing about this felt accidental. My dad eventually decided we would take everything to the police when we arrived. As we packed the items back into the box, I noticed one last piece of folded paper tucked discreetly at the bottom. It was a note with an address and a date, December 24th, exactly 1 year earlier. The address was for a small town where my dad had lived for a while as a young man. His face went pale when he saw it, as though something much bigger was at play. When we finally reached our destination, we handed the box to the police, explaining everything that had happened. The officer seemed skeptical but promised to investigate. We tried to move on, but none of us could shake the unease. That night, none of us slept well. My dad stayed by the window, staring out as if expecting the man to appear in the darkness. My mom kept bringing up stories from the past, searching for connections that might explain what the man wanted from us. And I couldn't stop thinking about the look he gave me before leaving the train, like he knew something about me that I didn't. We never saw the man again, and the investigation went nowhere. Weeks later, the police returned the box, saying there was nothing criminal or illegal about the objects. But the discomfort lingered. My dad decided to visit the address on the note by himself. When he came back, he seemed even more disturbed. He said the place was abandoned but showed signs of someone having lived there for years. He wouldn't go into details, only mentioning that he felt watched the entire time. To this day, we don't know who that man was or why he chose us. But every time I board a train at night, I find myself scanning the passengers, looking for a face I hope never to see again. I never liked taking the last train, especially on Christmas Eve, but that night I had no choice. The streets were deserted, blanketed in snow, and the only sound was the muffled crunch of my hurried footsteps toward the station. When I arrived, the place was nearly empty, save for an older man sitting on a bench across the platform, reading a worn-out newspaper. The train arrived right on time, and I quickly boarded, choosing a seat near the window. The carriage was almost empty, with only 2 other passengers who looked as exhausted as I felt. As the train began to move, I felt that familiar relief of finally being on my way home. But something felt different that night. Staring out the window, I noticed the train didn't seem to be passing through any familiar areas. There were no houses, no signs of life, just an endless void of darkness dotted with falling snow. I thought maybe I was just more tired than I realized, so I closed my eyes for a moment to relax. But when I opened them, the train was still moving through the same unchanging scenery of snow and darkness. No familiar stations, no announcements, just the monotonous sound of the wheels on the tracks. That's when I started to feel uneasy. The ride seemed to be taking much longer than it should. I glanced around, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening, but the other passengers had disappeared. I stood up and walked through the aisle, calling out, but no one answered. The carriages were empty, except for the hum of the train cutting through the night. My heart began to race, and a growing sense of dread settled over me. Just as I was about to return to my seat, the train screeched to an abrupt halt, throwing me against one of the seats. I looked out the window and saw something that didn't make sense. A small, snow-covered station with a sign that simply read midnight in weathered letters. Despite my better judgment, I decided to step off the train. Maybe there would be someone on the platform who could tell me what was going on. The icy air bit at my skin as soon as I stepped out, and the overwhelming isolation hit me like a wave. The platform was silent. No wind, no movement. When I turned back to look at the train, the doors were already closing. I ran, shouting, but it was too late. The train started moving again, slowly at first, then disappearing into the darkness, leaving me stranded at the station. I yelled for help, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. Trying to process what had just happened, I began to explore the station. The walls were coated in ice, and the clocks on the platform were frozen at midnight. No matter how long I waited, the hands never moved. I wandered up and down the platform, searching for an exit, but it seemed to stretch endlessly, always blanketed in the same thick layer of snow. I looked down the tracks, hoping to hear another train, but there was only silence. The sense that time itself had stopped was suffocating, as though I were trapped in a single, frozen moment. That's when I noticed something strange on the ground near the far end of the platform. A set of tiny footprints in the snow, as if left by a child. They led away from the platform into the darkness, fading into the distance. I hesitated, but staying on the platform seemed even more terrifying. As I followed the tracks, the silence grew heavier, almost as if it were watching me. The footprints ended abruptly in an empty patch of snow, with no sign of who had left them. But there, on the ground, was something unexpected. An old, yellowed note pinned under a stone. It read simply, "You shouldn't be here." Holding the note sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. It felt as though it had been left there specifically for me, as though someone knew I would end up in that place. My whole body trembled, and I couldn't tell if it was from fear or the freezing air. I looked around, searching for any sign of who might have written it, but the station remained eerily empty. Deciding to head back to the platform, I felt each step grow heavier, as if the snow itself were trying to hold me in place. When I finally returned, something had changed. The midnight sign was now covered in frost, the letters barely visible, as if the place itself were dissolving around me. I sat on one of the benches, trying to calm down and think of a way out. I started to convince myself that it was all a dream, but the biting cold and the ache in my frozen hands reminded me that it was all too real. Then I heard it. A faint sound at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps crunching in the snow. I stood up immediately, scanning the area, but saw nothing. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, drawing closer. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice echoing, but no one responded. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like an invisible presence circling me, waiting. Finally, at the edge of the platform, a figure emerged from the shadows. Tall and indistinct, it wore what looked like a long coat. I froze, unable to decide whether to run or scream. The figure simply stood there, watching me, unmoving. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, until it finally raised one hand and pointed to something behind me. When I turned, I saw the station's clock. It had begun to move, but not normally. The hands were spinning backward, counting time in reverse. When I turned back to face the figure, it was gone. In its place was another note, pinned to the snow. I picked it up with trembling hands and read the words, "The next train isn't going home." That was enough to send me into a panic. I had to get out of there, somehow. I began walking along the platform, searching for an escape, but it seemed to stretch endlessly, looping back to the same spot, always in front of that clock spinning backward. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a train approaching. The metallic screech of wheels on tracks grew louder and louder. I looked down the tracks and saw headlights piercing the darkness, growing closer. But something was wrong. The train wasn't normal. It was old and rusted, as though it had emerged from another era. When it stopped, the doors slid open automatically, revealing an interior shrouded in shadow and silence. I knew I shouldn't step inside, but staying on the platform felt like an even worse fate. With my heart pounding, I took a hesitant step forward. The moment I entered, the doors closed behind me, and the train began to move. There was no sense of time or direction, just a continuous journey through the void. Looking out the window, I saw the midnight station fading into the distance, dissolving into the snow. I realized that wherever this train was taking me, it wasn't home. I sat on the nearest bench, trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. The carriage was empty, but the feeling of a presence lingered, as though something unseen was occupying every shadowed corner. When I glanced at the reflection in the window, I saw it, the figure from the platform, now seated across from me, silent and unmoving. I finally understood. I had stepped into something I was never meant to. That train was just part of my routine, nothing more than a way to get home after long hours at work. It was Christmas Eve, and I was exhausted, eager for a hot shower and a few hours of sleep before the celebrations the next day. The carriage was nearly empty, as expected at that hour, just 2 or 3 people sitting far from me, each lost in their own thoughts or distracted by their phones. I took out my phone and opened a random game, trying to keep myself awake during the ride. That's when I got the first message from an unknown number. "You're on the 11:47 p.m. train. Car 4, window seat." I stared at the screen for a few seconds, trying to process it. That was exactly where I was. I glanced around, looking for someone who might be watching me, but the carriage seemed as ordinary as ever. I texted back, "Who is this?" No immediate response came. I tried to brush it off, but a few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. "Get off the train before the next stop. Passengers can't stay past midnight." My heart started to race. I had never heard of anything like that. I checked the clock on my phone. 11:58 p.m. It was impossible not to feel a chill run down my spine. I decided to do nothing and wait. Maybe it was a prank, I thought. Someone who got my number and decided to mess with me. I looked out the window, but all I saw was darkness and my own reflection. The train kept moving, and the silence in the carriage started to feel unnerving. No one was talking, no one was moving. I glanced at the other passengers and noticed something odd. One of them, a man in a suit sitting a few rows ahead, was staring directly at me. Not casually, intently, like he knew something I didn't. I tried to look away, but his gaze never shifted. When I checked my phone again, there was another message. "You don't have much time. If you don't get off, there's no turning back." A cold wave of fear swept through me. Whoever was sending these messages knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. I tried calling the number, but the call wouldn't connect. The signal, usually strong on this route, was suddenly weak. I glanced back at the man in the suit, but he was gone. He'd vanished, and the strange thing was the train hadn't stopped. No one had gotten off. Now, only 2 passengers remained in the carriage with me. A woman in a dark coat and an older man, both staring blankly ahead, as if in a trance. My mind raced. How could the man in the suit have disappeared without the train stopping? But there it was, the seat he'd been in, now empty. The 2 remaining passengers didn't react to anything. The woman and the older man sat perfectly still, like statues. I picked up my phone again, half expecting another message. It arrived almost instantly. "Don't ignore this. Time is running out." The clock on my phone now read 12:05 a.m. The train hadn't stopped at any station, and I began to notice something even more unsettling. There were no announcements, no sound of brakes, no typical movement. It was as if the train were moving to nowhere. I had to do something. I got up and walked to the nearest door, looking out. There was nothing but darkness. No station lights, no houses, just the reflection of the carriage in the glass. I banged on the door, tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The emergency panel, which should have had a button to call the conductor, was blank, as if it had never worked. I walked down the aisle, trying to talk to the other passengers. "Excuse me, do you know what's going on?" Nothing. The woman and the older man didn't even blink, as if I didn't exist. Then my phone vibrated again. The message read, "They're no longer here. You're next." I rushed back to my seat, my heart pounding. The clock now read 12:11 a.m. There was something sinister about the way time passed. Every minute felt stretched, yet everything was happening too quickly. When I looked up again, the carriage was completely empty. The two passengers who had seemed frozen were now gone, just like the man in the suit. I was utterly alone. The silence was deafening, broken only by the steady sound of the train's wheels on the tracks. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call anyone, but the calls wouldn't go through. My last resort was to text the unknown number. "What's happening? What do you want from me?" The reply came instantly. "This train isn't for you. Get off before it's too late." What did that even mean? Get off how? The train wasn't stopping. I stood again, walking toward the next door, searching for any way to manually evacuate. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the far end of the carriage, in the last row of seats, there was a shadow. It wasn't a person or anything I could clearly identify. It was as if the darkness itself had taken shape. I froze, unable to move. The shadow seemed to grow slowly, stretching and spreading, and the air around me grew thick and suffocating. The shadow moved in ways that defied logic. It seemed alive, expanding and contracting at the same time, creeping through the carriage. I tried to back away, but every step felt heavier than the last. It was as if the floor were trying to trap me, and the air was pressing down on my chest. I grabbed my phone again, hoping for some sort of instruction or response from the unknown number. The message came, brief and chilling. "Leave now or you'll stay with them." My heart felt like it would burst. Who were they? Did it include the people who had disappeared? And how was I supposed to leave a train that never stopped? The clock on my phone read 12:18 a.m. The shadow continued to spread, and even without eyes or a face, I could feel it watching me, waiting for something. Suddenly, the train began to slow down. There were no announcements, no warning, just the unmistakable sound of brakes. I ran to the nearest door, peering out the window. There was no platform, just darkness and snow, but the train was definitely stopping. My mind wavered between the fear of stepping into the void and the terror of staying inside the carriage with that thing. Finally, the doors slid open with an eerie mechanical hiss. The shadow loomed closer, almost enveloping me. Without thinking, I jumped out. As my feet hit the snow-covered ground, the train began to move again, faster this time. The doors slammed shut, and I watched as it vanished into the darkness, taking that horrifying presence with it. I looked around and realized I was in a completely desolate place. There were no signs of a station, no path, no lights in the distance. Only the sound of the wind and the overwhelming emptiness surrounded me. I pulled out my phone, desperate for direction, but the screen was black, as if the device had died. I stood there for what felt like hours, calling for help and hoping someone, or something, would appear. Eventually, in the distance, I saw a faint light, like a lantern swaying in the darkness. I cautiously approached it, step by step, until I found a man dressed in an old conductor's uniform. He looked at me with a grave expression and said, "You were lucky. Most people don't realize in time." Before I could respond, he disappeared, leaving me alone once again. I never found out exactly what happened that night or who was sending the messages, but ever since, I've avoided the last train, especially on Christmas Eve. Some journeys don't have a return, and I don't intend to test my luck again.